My name is Clara Bennett. I am 35 years old. And the strangest thing that ever happened to me at my sister's wedding was not the wedding dress that cost thousands of dollars. And it was not the glittering ballroom flooded with light at a country club outside Greenville, South Carolina. The thing I will remember for the rest of my life was the moment my face appeared on the giant LED screen behind the stage, right in the middle of the laughter of 200 guests. Beneath my photo, cruel words began appearing one after another, cold and bright against the screen. Runaway. Divorced. Childless. And then it got worse. The whole room burst into laughter as if it were nothing more than a harmless joke. My father smiled the way a man smiles when he believes he still has control of everything. My mother slowly swirled the wine in her glass and told the person beside her that I had always been too sensitive. And my sister, the bride that night, leaned into the microphone and told everyone not to laugh too hard or I might start crying. But I did not cry. I simply set my champagne glass down, unlocked my phone, and sent someone 2 words. Do it. 3 seconds later, the screen went black. And in those same 3 seconds, my sister's wedding began to fall apart. I will tell you how it got there. Because the truth is, it had started 4 weeks earlier, on a late rainy night in Asheville, when I was still sitting alone in my office under the cold yellow light, surrounded by half-finished drawings. The clock on my computer read 10:57. The building was almost empty. Outside the glass, the rain tapped steadily against the city like a patient, sorrowful hand. I was revising the east elevation of a church restoration project when my phone vibrated. Unknown number, South Carolina area code. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. Hello? There was a pause on the other end, as if the caller was deciding whether to continue. Then a woman's voice came through, quiet and careful. Is this Clara Bennett? This is she. My name is Marisol Green. I'm a nurse at Silver Pines Care Residence. I'm calling about Evelyn Hart. I shot to my feet so fast the chair slid hard across the floor behind me. My hand tightened around the phone. What happened to my grandmother? She's stable right now, she said immediately, as if she knew I had stopped breathing. But she is scheduled for heart surgery in 3 weeks. At her age, the doctors are not willing to promise anything. She is still alert, still clear-minded, and she asked me to call you. I turned away and looked out through the rain-streaked glass. My reflection blurred into the streetlights outside. Why didn't she call me herself? This time Marisol was silent longer. When she spoke again, her voice dropped, almost to a whisper. Because your name is no longer on the approved visitors list. I was not surprised. That was the part that made me cold. Who signed it? Your father, Victor Bennett. I closed my eyes. I could see his face perfectly in my mind, not when he was angry, but when he was calm. My father had always been most terrifying when he was calm. Marisol continued, still in that cautious voice. I should not say too much over the phone, but Evelyn told me I had to repeat her exact words. She said, if you still want to see her as yourself, then you need to come soon. Your family is preparing something for the wedding. I did not answer right away. I just listened to the rain, the hum of the air conditioner in the office, the pounding of my own heart inside my chest. Did she say anything else? Yes. She let out a soft breath. She kept every letter you ever sent. I saw them. She hid them in an old sewing box under her bed. She said that in that place, loving you had to be done in secret. That sentence entered me slowly and deeply, like cold water seeping through layers of cloth. I sat down on the edge of my desk, feeling my knees lose their strength. Would you help me with something? I asked. If I can. Tell her I answered the phone. Marisol's voice softened. I will. But you should know one more thing. They only lifted the ban if you agreed to come back for your sister's wedding. I laughed, but there was no joy in the sound. Of course. In my family, nothing was ever given without conditions attached. Even one last visit with my grandmother had to be traded for my presence in a room full of people who had spent years living inside a false version of me. But I knew one thing very clearly. I was not going back for them. I was going back because my grandmother might not get a second chance. After the call ended, I stood for a long time in that quiet office. On the wall across from me, my license reflected the light in silence. Clara Bennett. Licensed Preservation Architect. A name I had held on to through years with no one standing behind me, through jobs no one congratulated me for, through evenings when I had to remind myself that surviving was its own kind of victory. For 17 years they had told the whole town that I was the daughter who brought shame to the family. And now, at the exact moment my grandmother might be running out of time, they wanted me back, not because they missed me, but because they knew she was the only one with enough pull left to get me through that door. At the time, I did not yet know that dinner the following night would confirm the thing I feared most. I did not leave the office right after that call. I stayed another hour, the computer screen still glowing, the drawings still open, but my mind had drifted somewhere else long before. Back to Red Hollow, a small South Carolina town less than an hour from Greenville, to the lake at the edge of town, to the piece of land that still made something in my chest ache like an old shard of glass every time I thought about it. I was 18 when everything first began to break over that land. My grandmother, Evelyn Hart, gave it to me 2 years earlier on my 16th birthday. She did not make a scene of it. No huge cake, no ribbon, no movie-style speech, just a late autumn afternoon, driving me out to the lake shore in her old Buick, the air cold enough that you could see your breath. She stood in front of the weathered cabin, looked at the maple trees turning red, and placed an envelope in my hand. "I'm not leaving this to you because it's worth money," she said. "I'm leaving it to you because you are the only person in this family who can look at a place without immediately thinking about how much it could sell for." At the time, I did not fully understand what she meant. I only remember how warm and steady her hand felt. I remember the sound of the leaves rustling by the lake. I remember thinking, for the first time in my life, that someone was looking at me like I was a person they could trust. 2 years later, my father called me into the dining room and set a stack of papers in front of me. He did not sit down right away. He stood at the head of the table as if he were chairing a business meeting. Gray suit, steel watch, a voice so even it felt cold. My mother sat to his right, back straight, smoothing the fold of her napkin as if that were the only thing in the room worth worrying about. "Sign it," my father said. "The resort development on the north side of the lake needs that parcel to be complete. It's just paperwork." I looked down at the first page. Full transfer of ownership. My name in one corner, his company's name in the other. "That land was Grandma's gift to me," I said. He pulled out a chair and sat down, folding his hands in front of him. "Your grandmother let you hold it for now. I'm the one who knows what should actually be done with it." I shook my head. Not boldly, not dramatically. Just one very small shake of the head, but enough to change the air in the room. My father let out a short laugh with no warmth in it. "You are turning against your family over a piece of land?" My mother still did not look at me. She simply straightened her napkin again and said, in the flat voice of someone reciting a judgment she had long memorized, "That girl always thinks she's special." That hurt worse than shouting, because it was not an explosion. It was simply a quiet way of placing me outside the family, as if that had always been the obvious truth. I did not sign. 3 days later, I found out my college fund was gone. Not reduced, not frozen. Gone. The school's financial office told me the account had been fully withdrawn. I still remember standing in the hallway, phone in hand, listening to someone explain it all in a polite voice so calm it felt cruel, while my palms turned ice cold. A week later, my father stood at the front door with my suitcase thrown onto the porch the way someone throws away an object they no longer need. $58 in my wallet. A few changes of clothes. 1 pair of shoes. That was it. "If you walk out this door," he said, "don't ever call us family again." I stood there waiting, if only for 1 second, waiting for my mother to say something. Anything small. "Wait. Calm down. Let her stay tonight." But she only stood in the foyer with her hands folded at her waist, lips pressed together, as if silence were the cleanest way to keep the floor spotless. I stepped outside. The door closed behind me with such clean certainty that it almost felt ceremonial. But the most painful part was not the night they threw me out. It was the next morning, when the story about me had already reached the whole town before I had. My father told people I ran away with an older man, that I had done something shameful to disgrace the family. that I was no longer fit to continue school. In Red Hollow, people did not need evidence. They only needed a voice confident enough to tell the story first. And my father had always been very good at telling stories. I thought that was the worst of it. I was wrong. I left Red Hollow in an old borrowed car from a school friend, and for the first 2 weeks, the most stable place I had to sleep was the parking lot behind a gas station outside Charlottesville. At night, I leaned the seat back just far enough to drift in and out of sleep, pulled my coat over myself, listened to trucks coming and going, and told myself that getting through today was enough. In the morning, I washed my face in the restroom, tied my hair back, and stepped to the counter with a smile I learned very quickly. Polite enough to keep people from asking questions, normal enough to make sure no one guessed I had slept in my car. First came the night shift at a bakery. The smell of butter, flour, and lightly burnt coffee clung to my hair for months. After that came the roadside diner, where I poured coffee for truck drivers, older couples, and people heading into early shifts. I remember one morning when an older woman looked at my name tag and asked, "Clara, are you in college?" I set a plate of pancakes in front of her and smiled. "I'm trying to find my way there." She nodded as if she understood that feeling better than I expected. "Then keep going." And I did. I took remedial classes. I enrolled in community college. I transferred to a university through scholarships and small aid packages I had to read line by line. I chose preservation architecture not because it was the easiest path, but because the first time I stood inside an old building with cracks running down its walls, I recognized something in it. Things left behind. Things people looked at and assumed were ruined. Maybe I chose that work because deep down, I had always wanted to believe that some abandoned things could still be saved. The years that followed were never easy. I just became better at carrying them. I graduated. I found work. I learned how to walk into meeting rooms with my shoulders straight and my voice calm, even when inside me there was still the instinct of the girl who had once been thrown out with a suitcase. Then I met Silas Rowan. He spoke gently, opened doors for me, remembered that I liked my coffee black, and knew exactly how to make a woman who had grown up starved for care believe she had finally found the right person. In public, Silas was the kind of man who made people tell me I was lucky. Only I knew that behind closed doors, that gentleness slowly turned into control. He wanted to know where I went, who I saw, what I spent, who I called, why I was quiet. Everything always started with a sentence that sounded perfectly reasonable. "I'm just worried about you." Or, "You know how many people out there would love to take advantage of you." By the time I realized I was asking permission for even the smallest things, that marriage had become a windowless room. I left when I was 31. No drama, no scene. I just gathered what was still mine and walked out one more time. Not long after that, I sat in a bright white exam room and listened to a doctor explain, in a professional and gentle voice, that my chances of getting pregnant naturally were almost non-existent. I sat still with both hands on my lap and nodded as if I were listening to someone describe another woman's life. I never told my family. I never even considered it. With them, pain had always been something that could be taken and used for the wrong purpose. Only Silas knew. He was the one sitting beside me that day, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder like a real husband. That is why, years later, when those words appeared on the screen in the middle of the wedding, I understood immediately that some doors I thought had been shut forever had never really been locked. In Asheville, people know me as the woman who handles difficult restoration plans. Across the region, including Greenville, I have clients, colleagues, and my name on project files. Out there, I am steady, composed, reliable. Only in Red Hollow am I still the daughter they told the whole town about so many times that people came to believe the story more than the person herself. I went back to Red Hollow on a Friday afternoon washed in pale sunlight, the kind of light that makes everything look calmer than it really is. From a distance, my family's house came into view, so familiar that my chest tightened on reflex. White porch, flag in the yard, shrubs trimmed into perfect shape. Everything was still clean, neat, flawless, like a photograph in a Southern lifestyle magazine. The Bennett family had always been good at that. keeping the outside so immaculate that no one wanted to ask how rotten the inside had become. The moment I stepped through the door, my mother looked me up and down. No hug, no greeting, just a slight tilt of the head, as if she were inspecting an item that had finally been returned. "Your hair is darker than it used to be," she said. "It makes you look older." I set my bag on the chair by the door. "Hello, Mother?" Her eyes moved over my face one more time. "You seem thinner," but not in a flattering way. Probably from working too much. That was always how my mother spoke. She never insulted me directly. She simply layered small observations onto me, neat and tidy as folded napkins, until eventually I was the one left feeling like something was wrong with me. My father was already seated at the dining table when I walked into the room. The silverware was in perfect position. The water glass was not off by half an inch. The cream-colored napkin had been folded into a perfect rectangle. He looked at me the way someone looks at a guest invited out of obligation, then gave the slightest nod. "Clara." "Father." He motioned for me to sit down, as if this were a meeting instead of a family meal. A few minutes later, Lila came in, her perfume arriving before her voice did. She gave me a light, practiced hug, just enough for an outsider to call it affection, then sat down with a smile that had been rehearsed too well. The diamond on her left hand caught the light immediately. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, lifting her hand and turning her wrist slightly. Evan picked it out. 4 carats. The whole Prescott family loves classic pieces. "Good for you," I said. Lila smiled thinly. "Still alone, Clara?" The question was asked as lightly as if she were commenting on the weather, but the table went quiet the second it was spoken. My father cut into his meat without looking up. My mother took a sip of water. No one stopped my sister, because in that house the cruelest things were always allowed to exist as long as they were wrapped in a polite tone. My father finally spoke, his eyes still on his plate. "I hear you do some kind of design work in Asheville?" "I'm a preservation architect." He smirked. "Oh, so you fix up old houses?" I looked at him for a few seconds. "If that's what you want to call it." Lila laughed first, as if I had conveniently slipped right into the role of the difficult one they had all been waiting for. My mother turned to me, her expression calm. "At the very least, you should smile more tomorrow. When your face gets tight like that, you don't look approachable at all." I did not answer. I ate slowly, listening to the clink of silverware against plates, listening to Lila talk about table linens brought in from Charleston, the menu, how important the Prescott family was in that part of the state. Every sentence she spoke carried the same message underneath it. "Look where I stand, and look where you're sitting at this table, like someone only reluctantly allowed to be here." By dessert, Lila stood up, disappeared for a few minutes, then came back carrying a long ivory box. She set it down in front of me, her pale pink fingernails brushing lightly over the lid. "I had someone pick out something more appropriate for you to wear to the wedding. The Prescotts are very observant. I thought you might want to blend in a little." I opened the box. Inside was a pale gray dress, almost 2 sizes too big for me, with a high neckline, 3/4 sleeves, and a cut so matronly that if I had seen it hanging in a store, I would have assumed it belonged to a woman at least 10 years older than I was. It was not ugly. It was simply designed so no one would remember the person wearing it. My mother looked down at the dress and gave a small approving nod. "This color suits you better, less attention-grabbing." I looked up and caught Lila's eyes. She smiled sweetly. "I just want everything to feel harmonious." I closed the lid gently. "Of course." I stayed just long enough that no one could call me rude. When I stood to excuse myself, my father only said, "Be on time tomorrow, and remember, not every evening needs to become a stage for personal emotion." I picked up my car keys and stepped into the hallway. On my way to the front door, I passed my father's study. The door was not fully closed. I had no intention of stopping until I heard his voice carry through the gap, low and steady, the same voice he used when discussing business. "After the wedding, the land issue is as good as locked down." A short pause. "The old woman isn't lucid enough to testify anymore." I stopped cold. Not the kind of frozen that comes from hurt, but the kind that happens when scattered pieces suddenly snap together all at once. Marisol's call. The condition that I had to attend the wedding if I wanted to see my grandmother. The way my family had abruptly decided they wanted me there, at exactly this moment. I turned toward the half-open study door, my hand tightening around my keys until it hurt. They had not called me back to reconcile. They had not even called me back just to put me in my place one more time. This wedding was not simply a stage for humiliating me. It was the final step in a plan almost 20 years in the making. A way to seal the lie, erase the last voice still capable of challenging it, and leave the whole town believing that my father's version of the story was the only version that had ever existed. But what my grandmother handed me the next morning was even bigger than that. The next morning, I drove to Silver Pines, under the pale light of early fall, feeling calm in the way only people who are too exhausted to panic anymore can feel calm. My mother came with me, just as my father had arranged. She sat in the passenger seat, wearing expensive perfume, her phone already resting on her lap, occasionally replying to messages without looking at me once. During the entire drive, we said exactly two things to each other. She asked whether I had brought the dress Leela gave me. I said no. She let out a small breath through her nose, as if my lack of cooperation were a habit of mine that had been exhausting her for years. Silver Pines still smelled the way I remembered, antiseptic, clean linens, and weak coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. At the front desk, the receptionist looked at her screen, then at me, hesitating slightly before she said, "Your name has been added back to the list. 30 minutes. My mother answered for me. That will be enough. She did not come in with me. She chose a chair in the hallway, crossed her legs, and opened her phone as if this were just one more task to get through in the middle of a long wedding to-do list. Before I went into the room, she looked up and said in a flat voice, "Don't tire her out." I did not respond. My grandmother was sitting by the window with a light blanket over her knees. She was much thinner than the last time I had seen her. The bones in her wrists stood out beneath her papery skin, and her white hair had grown sparse, but her eyes were still the same, bright, deep, and so clear that the second I saw them, I had to look away for a moment to keep my throat from breaking open. "Come here," she said. I sat down beside the bed. She took my hand immediately, her hand lighter than it used to be, but still warm. That one touch alone was enough to make me bite down hard on my lip. "Let me look at you." She studied me for a long time, as if trying to make up for the years someone else had stolen from us. "You're better than they said." I smiled, but my eyes burned. "You're sharper than they think." The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "I never believed what they said about you." Her voice lowered, softened in a way that made my heart ache. I just wasn't strong enough to fight them any longer. I lowered my head. All the layers I had built around myself over the years, composure, toughness, control, suddenly felt frighteningly thin in front of that sentence. Not because I had never hoped to hear it, but because I had hoped for it so long that I had nearly forgotten it was even possible. She glanced toward the door, waited a beat to make sure no one outside could hear, then slowly reached inside her robe. She pulled out an old, pale yellow envelope, the edges softened from being hidden too long. "Take it." I took the envelope and my fingertips went cold. Inside were three things. The first was a copy of the deed to the lakeside land. My name was still there, clear and intact. I turned to the second page. A handwritten letter in my grandmother's hand, dated years ago, a letter that had never reached me. The last page was a photocopy of a transfer from a trust in Evelyn Hart's name into a corporate account I knew very well belonged to my father. I looked up. "What is this?" She looked straight at me. "Your tuition money." For a second I thought I had heard her wrong. Dad said he had been saving for me since I was little. "Your father says a lot of things." She tightened her hand around mine. "That money came from my trust. I set it aside for you a long time ago. When you refused to sign over the land, Victor took it out. It didn't disappear. It was taken." For several seconds I could not speak. The room was still quiet, the sunlight was still resting across the windowsill, and yet I felt something ancient inside me finally crack wide open. For 17 years I had believed the cruelest thing my father ever did was throw me out and call it a lesson. But no. He had taken the very future someone else prepared for me, used it for himself, then let the whole town believe I had destroyed my own life. He told everyone I lost my education because I was reckless, I said, my voice rough. He needed you to carry that shame for him, she said. It made his life easier. I looked back down at the papers in my hands. The land was still mine. The tuition money had never been a gift from my father. And the story I had lived with for nearly half my life had been built out of truth, carefully swapped and twisted until it became something else. My grandmother waited until I finished reading the letter before she spoke again. Listen to me, Clara. They did not bring you back because they want to make things right. They brought you back because they think I'm about to lose the clarity to remember what was real. They want to lock the story in place before the last person who can tell it differently is gone. I folded the papers carefully, slowly, as if moving too fast would make my hands shake. Out in the hallway, I could hear footsteps passing by, then my mother's voice floating in and out of a phone call about seating charts, flowers, arrival times. Their lives were still moving smoothly, still arranged beautifully as always, even while the truth sat quietly in my hands. My grandmother tugged lightly on my hand to bring me closer. Don't let them keep telling your story for you. I looked up. If they turned you into a story this town could swallow whole, she said, each word clear. Then this time, you have to be the one to tell it back. I left Silver Pines with the old envelope in my purse. I dropped my mother back at the house in complete silence, waited until she shut the front door behind her, and only then turned the car toward Asheville. On the drive back, I did not turn on any music. I drove through hills blurred by sunlight, down roads that smelled like dry leaves and warm gasoline, both hands gripping the wheel hard, as if loosening them even a little would let every emotion in me spill out at once. That evening, I called Julian Cross, a trusted colleague and one of the very few people in my life who had ever seen me at my worst without trying to use it against me. He answered on the second ring. What's wrong? I need your help with something. Julian was quiet for a beat. He was always like that. He never crowded someone else's exhaustion with unnecessary questions. Okay, he said. When? In an hour. My office. When Julian arrived, I was still standing by my desk, coat still on, my grandmother's envelope lying in front of me like a warning that from this point forward, I no longer had the right to pretend I did not know the truth. Julian looked at me, then at the envelope, then pulled out a chair and sat down. Family? I nodded. I told him everything. Marisol's call, dinner at the house, what I heard my father say on the phone, the papers my grandmother gave me. Julian did not interrupt. He sat still with both elbows on his knees, listening with the kind of focus that had become rare in an age when everyone seemed in a hurry to react before fully understanding. When I finished, the room stayed quiet for a few seconds. What do you want to do? He asked. I looked out the window, where the lights of Asheville were coming on one by one. I don't want to ruin the wedding. Julian gave a slight nod, as if that were exactly the answer he had expected. But I'm not walking into that room empty-handed either. I said, if they try to humiliate me in front of everyone, I want the truth in that room too. He leaned back a little. Then we do it clean. We started with the simplest things. Julian found out which audiovisual company the venue had hired for the evening. He was good at work like that, not flashy, not dramatic, just quietly fitting small pieces together until the picture became clear. By the next afternoon he called me back. They're short a backup tech for the slideshow, he said. If I take the freelance shift, I can get into the booth legally. I was standing in my kitchen, still holding an empty mug. Are you sure? I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm just standing in the right place if I need to. That night, I opened my laptop and began building my own presentation. No dramatic music, no embarrassing photos of anyone, not one mocking line, just the truth in the exact order I had built it with my own life. I knew the name Clara Bennett might not mean anything in Red Hollow anymore, but in my profession, it was different. Margaret Prescott had seen my portfolio, project photos, and my name through her family's foundation before. We had simply never met face to face. A photo of me on graduation day, standing alone outside the campus, smiling even though no one was waiting for me in the parking lot. A scan of my license. A photo of the historic train station in Greenville I was restoring. The plaque for an industry award sitting on my office shelf. A photo of the small house I bought with my own money, with a wooden porch and a rosemary planter by the door. One image of my grandmother's handwritten letter, the pen strokes shaky but the words steady. The final slide had a black background and white text, just a few words. The cruelest lie is the one a family repeats until the town believes it. Julian watched the whole file without commenting right away. He simply scrolled back to the top and watched it again, more slowly. "It works," he said at last. "No attack, no performance. Nothing here gives them room to say you made anything up. I don't want to become them." He looked up at me. "Then don't." I leaned back against my desk, arms folded across my chest. "If they behave decently that night, I won't use it." Julian did not answer right away. He knew my family well enough to understand how fragile that hope was, but he also knew I needed that principle for myself. "Then set a clear condition," he said. "Only if they strike first." I nodded. On the laptop screen, a photo of me standing in front of a red brick building glowed in the late afternoon light. The woman in the photo looked steady, calm, almost nothing like the girl who had once been thrown out of her house with $58 in a suitcase. But I knew they were the same person. The only difference was that now I no longer confused silence with dignity. Julian plugged a new flash drive into the computer, copied the file, then set it on the desk between us. "If we never need it, even better," he said. I looked at that tiny flash drive, something small enough to fit between two fingers, and yet heavy with the part of my life people had twisted for nearly 20 years. "And if we do," I said quietly, "then this time, I want that room to see me in the real light." And by the following night, I understood they had prepared a different role for me. I arrived at the country club 15 minutes early enough to walk across the velvet-smooth lawn and past the rows of white flowers on my own, without having to arrive with anyone from my family. The building glowed in the evening light, stone columns, tall glass, waitstaff moving silently, as if the place had been designed specifically to hold expensive nights and families who knew exactly when to smile. At the welcome table, the young woman holding the seating chart looked down at my name, then back up at me with a polished smile. "Table 17, ma'am, back left." Back left turned out to mean right beside the kitchen door. Every time the swinging doors opened, a rush of heat and the sound of dishes crashing together swept across my shoulder. At my table were two distant cousins, an older married couple I had never met, and one man from the bride's side who probably did not remember who I was. No one was rude. The arrangement was simply too deliberate to be accidental. I looked toward the front of the room. The head table was covered in white linen, low candles, and crystal, catching the light. The Prescott family sat near the center, like a declaration that this night was not just a wedding. It was also a performance of status. My father was standing beside Mr. Prescott, his body angled in that familiar way of his, the one he used when he was smiling and calculating at the same time. I could not hear what he was saying, but I knew that expression too well. It was the face my father wore whenever he wanted someone to believe working with him was a privilege. Lila appeared a few minutes later in a fitted wedding gown, hair pinned low, her smile so perfect it was almost emotionless. She moved from table to table, touching shoulders, tilting her head, bending slightly, greeting people like an actress who knew exactly where every eye in the room was pointed. When she reached my table, she paused just long enough for outsiders to call it sisterly affection. "You came," she said, her eyes flicking over the navy dress I was wearing. "I was afraid you might do something unpredictable." "Tonight Evan is marrying you," I said. "No one needs to be afraid of my part in it." Her smile did not change, but the corners of her eyes tightened. "Let's hope not." Once dinner began, everything unfolded as beautifully and correctly as nights like that are supposed to. Glasses clinked. The speeches were warm enough to make the guests feel they were witnessing a family worth admiring. Then Lila took the microphone. She stood in the lights with one hand against her chest and the other holding the mic, and when she spoke, her voice was as soft as velvet. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight. To me, family has always been the most important thing." She paused and smiled, and several tables near the front nodded along approvingly. "Although every family has one person who makes everything heavier than it needs to be." Mine is no exception. The room responded with polite laughter. Not loud, but loud enough for the person being targeted to hear it clearly. My mother appeared beside me a few seconds later, as if she had timed it. She did not sit down. She only leaned closer, the scent of expensive perfume settling over my shoulder. Just stay seated, she said softly, while keeping the same smile for everyone else. Don't embarrass us again. I did not look at her. You should save that line for the right person. She straightened immediately and walked away as if she had never stopped at my table. Then the lights dimmed. The giant screen behind the stage lit up with childhood pictures of Lila. Plastic princess dresses, her 6th birthday, high school formal, engagement photos with Evan on a lawn. The whole room softened exactly the way a well-produced family slideshow is meant to soften it. There was laughter, murmured admiration, people saying the bride looked beautiful, that the two families were such a wonderful match. For one very brief moment, I almost thought maybe they would stop there. That maybe my grandmother had made me too alert. That maybe, just this once, they would choose kindness for the sake of their own reputation. Then the music changed. No more soft piano, a lighter, more mischievous tune began. The screen shifted to photos of me, not recent ones. Old photos, carefully chosen from the worst possible angles, eyes half shut, mouth uneven, hair messy, shoulders hunched in ugly light. The first word appeared across the screen, runaway. A few hesitant laughs rose up. Next photo, unstable. The laughter grew a little louder. Third photo, divorced. My father did not look toward me. He sat perfectly straight, as if this were just another harmless part of the evening's program. Childless. Bitter. I heard one woman at a nearby table take in a small, sharp breath. The man across from her turned his face away, as if not looking directly at it would somehow free him from being responsible for sitting there. Lila stood by the microphone with a thin smile on her face, waiting patiently for the room to understand that this was the surprise she had prepared. The atmosphere had changed now. It was no longer fully cheerful, but it still was not uncomfortable enough for anyone to rise and stop it. That was exactly the kind of cruelty my family loved best. Push someone right to the edge, but leave just enough room to call it a joke if anyone challenged it. Then the final slide appeared. It was not just text, it was a cropped image of private medical information no one in that room should ever have seen. My name, part of a date, a few clinical terms, and a stretch of cold blank space more vicious than any caption, because it forced everyone in the room to fill in the rest for themselves. I did not hear laughter anymore. Only a warped, uneasy silence that had arrived too late. I looked up at the screen, then toward the head table. Lila was still standing there. My mother sat very still, as if she knew nothing. My father tilted his head slightly toward the Prescott family, wearing an expression that was almost apologetic on behalf of his complicated daughter. I did not need to ask who had given them that record. In my life, only one person other than the doctor had sat beside me in that bright white exam room that day. And in that moment, I understood something I had only ever felt vaguely before. They did not just want to embarrass me. They wanted to nail their version of me into the minds of the Prescott family that very night. So my father could smile and play the role of a trustworthy man, disciplined enough to control even the most troublesome part of his family. At some point, my hand was already on my phone. The message thread with Julian was still open, those same 2 words glowing white against the dark screen. I do not know what another person would have done in a moment like that. Stayed silent to protect their dignity, or stood up and let the truth speak for itself. But I knew I could not sit there any longer. I looked for one final second, almost as if I were honoring every chance at decency they had torn apart with their own hands. Then I hit send. Do it. The screen went black so fast that some people in the room had not even registered what had happened yet. The last scattered laugh died somewhere near the bride's side and vanished. In that instant, the whole room seemed held between 2 breaths. No one spoke. No one knew whether it was a technical glitch or something else. Then the screen lit up again. Black background, white text. Clear, spare, no music, no effects. This is who you trained this town to hate. This is who I became anyway. I heard the clean sound of a fork touching a plate somewhere near the front. Just that one tiny noise was enough to make the silence in the room feel sharp as glass. The first slide showed a photo of me on graduation day. Not the most flattering one, but a real one. I was standing outside the campus in a dark blue gown, my hair blown slightly sideways by the wind, looking straight at the camera like someone who had come very far just to stand exactly there. The line underneath was simple: graduated with honors, scholarship transfer student. There was no laughter now. The second slide was a scan of my license. The third was a photo of me standing inside a red brick train station under restoration, wearing a hard hat and holding blueprints. The next showed a professional award. Then the small house I had bought with my own money. Every image was clean, calm, unaggressive, needing no defense. They simply stood there, needing no defense at all. I did not immediately look at the head table, but I could feel the shift in the room the way you can feel weather turn before a storm. People started looking from the screen to me, then from me to my family. The expressions that had once been evasive or coated in pity were changing into something else: recognition. On the final slide, one line appeared: she rebuilt her life after being thrown out at 18. At that exact moment, a chair at the head table scraped backward. I looked up. Margaret Prescott was standing. She did not rush. There was nothing theatrical about the way she rose. She was simply a woman getting to her feet with the quiet authority of someone well used to rooms falling silent when she began to speak. Her pearl-colored gown caught the light softly, and her face was not angry, but it had gone unmistakably cold. "I know her," she said. Her voice was not loud, but everyone in the room heard it. Lila turned sharply. "Mrs. Prescott, I think there's been some misunderstanding." Margaret lifted one hand, not high, just enough to stop the sentence in midair. Her gaze moved from the screen to me, then to my father. "She is the woman our office has thought highly of for the past 8 months. She paused. "The architect my family's foundation has been considering for the Charleston Theater restoration." Her voice dropped lower, sharper. "And this family thought using her medical records as entertainment at a wedding was acceptable?" The entire room changed at that sentence. I watched my father stand too quickly, the smile returning to his face a half-second too late, so that it looked more like a crack than an expression. "Margaret, please understand, this was just a family joke, a small misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Margaret repeated, without raising her voice. "I do not see anything unclear about this." I stood up from my table. My knees were steady, my hands were steady too. That was the part that surprised me most. I had imagined that if this moment ever came, I would shake. But I did not. Maybe because when someone has been misrepresented for too long, the body recognizes truth before the mind does. I walked into the center of the room. Not quickly. Not lunging for the microphone. Not scanning the room for allies. I simply stood where everyone could see me and spoke in a voice just loud enough to carry. I did not drop out of school. My father turned toward me at once. "Clara, that's enough." My tuition was taken from me. I kept going, my voice even, like I was presenting plans I had reviewed too many times to be afraid of getting wrong. "I did not leave home on my own. I was thrown out at 18. Lila shook her head, her lips moving as if she wanted to jump in, but no sound came out. "I did not betray my family out of stubbornness," I said. "I refused to sign over the land my grandmother gave me." My father took one step forward. "You don't know what you're talking about." For the first time in my life, I looked straight at him from that distance, and did not feel myself getting smaller. "No," I said. "You're the one who never wanted anyone to know what you did." The room went so still I could hear the air conditioning above us. "The person who took my tuition money," I said, each word landing clean and heavy, "was not the school. Not an administrative mistake, not fate. It was my father." And for the first time in my life, no one in that room rushed to believe him faster than they believed me. My father was still standing there, the smile continuing to come apart on his face, trying to piece control back together with the familiar tone of a man who had spent too many years surviving by speaking first, speaking louder, and speaking as if he must naturally be right. "Clara is emotional," he said, turning halfway toward the groom's side. "She's always had a tendency to." "I'm not emotional." I cut in, my voice still low. "I came prepared." I opened my purse and took out the old envelope my grandmother had hidden inside her robe. The whole room followed that movement, but I did not raise it like a performance. I simply opened it, took out the papers one by one, and walked them over to Margaret Prescott. Beside her, Daniel Prescott, the family's longtime attorney, who had sat almost silently, observing all night, had gotten to his feet at some point too. "You should see these," I said. Margaret took them first. Daniel leaned in to read them with her. Neither of them spoke right away. That silence was more frightening than an immediate reaction, because it meant the papers were clear enough not to need explanation. The first page was the deed to the lakeside land, my name still intact. The second was a copy of the transfer from the trust my grandmother had set aside for me, the money that should have paid for my education, but had instead been diverted into my father's company. The last was my grandmother Evelyn's handwritten letter, the handwriting shaky but unmistakably clear, confirming everything in a way that could not be explained away. My father stepped toward them. "Margaret, this is more complicated than it looks." Daniel looked up first. "Actually, it isn't." Those 4 words alone were enough to shift the whole room completely to the other side. Before I could say anything else, Evan Prescott stood up. His chair dragged hard across the wood floor, dry and abrupt, and Lila spun toward him. "Evan?" she asked, the smile now gone entirely. He did not look at her right away. He looked at me first, then turned to the woman he had married only hours earlier. "I asked you about Clara last week," he said. "I asked because something felt off in the way everyone talked about her." His voice was not loud, but every word was clear. "You told me she was unstable, that she made things up, that she was obsessed with this family and always wanted to ruin everything." Lila had gone pale. "Evan, not now. This is exactly the time." He stepped fully away from the wedding table, standing apart from her, as if he had finally seen something he could no longer ignore. "I didn't know you were this kind of person. Or maybe I did not want to know." No one had to say it aloud. The simple fact that the groom was no longer standing beside the bride was enough for everyone in the room to understand that this marriage had just split along a deep line, right there on the still warm floor of the reception. That was when my mother truly lost her composure. She rose abruptly, one hand trembling against the back of her chair. "This is absurd," she said, but her voice no longer had its usual edge. "Every family has misunderstandings." "No," Margaret said, her eyes still on the letter in her hand. "Not every family uses its daughter to purchase someone else's approval." That sentence struck my mother harder than any scream could have. She sat back down slowly, as if for the first time in her life, she did not know what version of grace she could use to hide her face. I left the country club not long after that. No one stopped me. No one called my name. Outside, the sky had gone fully dark, and the air was colder than it had been when I arrived, carrying the smell of damp grass and pine from the trees in the distance. I stood beside my car and finally let myself take one deep breath. My phone vibrated in my hand. A message from Marisol. "Evelyn just heard what happened. She asked me to tell you this. You didn't make them fall apart tonight. You just stopped holding them up." I read that line over and over under the parking lot lights. Inside, my father had probably already begun losing the first partners he once believed would stay forever. My mother probably still had no idea that invitations from the town's charity circles would slowly stop coming. Maybe Lila was still standing in her expensive wedding dress, understanding for the first time what it felt like to have a whole room look at her differently. As for me, standing in the cold that night, I felt only a strange stillness opening inside me. And I knew that stillness was not the end of me. It was only the first time this story truly belonged to me. They used to think what made me weak was the fact that I had no children, no husband, no family standing behind me to hold me up. But that night, I realized the opposite was true. What made me strongest was not that I had defeated them in a room full of people. It was that I no longer needed their permission to have a seat at their table. And maybe that is what stayed with me the longest after that night. Not my father's face when the truth stopped standing with him. Not the silence of the room when my story was finally told correctly. But the strange feeling of driving away from that place and realizing I was no longer shaking. Some wounds inside a family do not heal the way people hope they will. They do not return to what they were before. They simply reach a day when they stop controlling you. And when that happens, you understand that peace does not always come from reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from no longer asking other people to acknowledge your pain before you allow yourself to move forward. I think a lot of us, especially those of us who grew up in families where silence was treated like duty and sacrifice was expected, have spent many years trying to relearn one very simple truth. You still have value, even if the people who brought you into this world never saw it. I have a question for you, and I want you to answer honestly. If your family called you tomorrow after years of silence, what do you think they would say? Help me, or I'm sorry. Leave your answer in the comments. I read every comment, and I truly value the stories people share there with one another. And if this story touched you in a personal way, you can subscribe and stay with me for the next ones. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about real people, real pain, and the moment they take back their own voice, check the description. You may find a voice there that reminds you that you are not alone. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Thank you for listening with such kindness. I'll see you in the next video.